This is being hosted by Women in International Security Australia, and we have a YouTube channel, so we'll be posting this on the YouTube channel for everyone to, for people who weren't able to join us to join in. So welcome everyone to this event for the book launch of Dr. Federica Caso. I'm Marie Ross-Rubley at the University of Melbourne. I'm president of Women in International Security Australia, or WIIS Australia, as we often call it. To start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I acknowledge sovereignty has never been ceded. If you'd like, in the chat, you're welcome to put in the lands from which you're dialing in on. So, as you know, we're here today to hear about Dr. Caso's new book. She's a lecturer in international relations at Trobe University, and she's one of the executive board members here of WIIS Australia. Her research examines gender and race in the military. Besides her new book, Federica's research on militarism and settler colonialism features in journals such as Security Dialogue, International Political Sociology, the Australian Journal of Political Science, and the Australian Journal of Politics and History. Her new research project examines Indigenous military programs and initiatives in the defense of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand to try and understand whether they contribute to reconciliation. Now, hosting the book launch today, sort of engaging and asking questions of Federica, are Carolyn Holbrook and Mia Martin-Hobbs. So Carolyn is Associate Professor in History at the Center for Contemporary Histories at Deakin University. Her research spans a range of contemporary political, policy, and cultural issues, including the history of the Australian Federation, the conceptual history of national security in Australia, the history of Medicare, and more. With James Walter, she's publishing a history of political decision-making in Australia next year, and she's also director of Australian Policy and History, which connects historical evidence to contemporary political and social issues. So she's a stellar expert, to chat with Federica about her book. And Dr. Mia Martin-Hobbs is an oral historian of war and conflict with research interest in memory, trauma, place, gender, and security. She completed her PhD at the University of Melbourne, and her doctoral project became her first book, Return to Vietnam, an oral history of American and Australian veterans' journeys, with Cambridge University Press. She's published her research in the Australian Journal of Politics and History, Journal of American History, and Oral History Review. She's presently a Deakin University postdoctoral research fellow, where she's undertaking a transnational oral history project with women and minority veterans from a range of countries. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carolyn, who will open the session in which she and Mia chat with Federica about her book. We will be reserving at least 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience, so please feel free to gather your questions because we will have time for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to everybody for coming along to Federica's book launch. I'll just say a couple of words and then I'll hand over to Mia and then we'll start with some questions. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we're gathered and acknowledge that at the basis of our discussions today lies the issue of the colonisation of Indigenous lands and the violence that occurred in the taking of those lands. So thank you, Federica, for the honour of being invited to launch your book along with Mia. And congratulations on the production of Settler Military Politics, a book that will stand as a significant contribution to the scholarly literature of Anzac and Australia's settler colonialism. There is a substantial literature on the Anzac legend, much of it produced in recent years by historians who have been critical of the role of politicians since the 1990s in greatly increasing the prominence of Anzac commemoration, principally by pouring extraordinary amounts of money into educational resources and into the Australian War Memorial. Where your book is original and really important, I think, Federica, is in providing a theoretical framework to help us understand the connection between the Great Australian silence about frontier violence and the Great Australian bellicosity about the First World War. The 2010 publication, What's Wrong with Anzac, by Henry Reynolds, Marilyn Lake, Mark McKenna, Joy DeMusi and Karina Donaldson, drew a link between the energy with which the state has promoted 1915 as the birth of the Australian nation and the energy with which it has suppressed acknowledgement of frontier violence. But your work goes further, I think, in helping us to understand the relationship between Australia's settler colonialism and Anzac commemoration, and between the Australian War Memorial's desire to celebrate Indigenous service in settler colonial armies, a trend very noticeable over the last couple of decades, and its resistance to covering the frontier wars. Now, I'm really interested in how your background as someone who comes from outside Australian cultural settings and from outside a settler colonial experience, how that background has informed your scholarship. Federica arrived in Brisbane from the UK in 2015 to begin her PhD studies with Roland Bleicher on the subject of visual politics and militarisation in liberal democracies. And as some of you will remember, 2015 was the year of the Anzac centenary, of peak Anzac. And I wondered when I was reading Federica's book, what she made of the Anzac centenary, having been raised in Italy and lived for many years in the UK, what you made landing in Australia in 2015, what you made of our enthusiasm for commemorating the First World War. I imagine you quite possibly didn't even realise that Australia had fought in the First World War. As David Stevens at Honest History has done a great job of pointing out, Australia spent more than any other country in the world in commemorating the centenary of the First World War, and almost more than all other countries combined. And David and other people produced extraordinary figures, one of which I can remember. Per capita, Australia spent around $9,000 on First World War commemoration. And there was a comparison with Germany, which was $1. So Australia, $9,000. Germany, a major combatant, $1. But I mean, the figures for the UK and France weren't particularly higher either, the victorious nations. And then I imagine Italy would have been probably something like 10 cents if that had been put into the figures as well. So Federica's book opens with this arresting scene as she describes a field trip to Canberra in 2017, which included visiting the Australian War Memorial and attending Anzac Day commemorations. For someone whose research interests lie in the aesthetics of war, of politics and nationalism, it's hard to imagine a more fruitful research activity, I think. I won't preempt Federica, as I'm hoping she'll share some of her experience of that 2017 field trip with us in a moment, except to say that one of my favourite parts of the introduction was when Federica described how a woman standing next to her in the dark, as they waited for the dawn service to begin, remarked to her friend about the cold, rainy weather. And her friend responded that the rain and cold would help them identify with the soldiers who landed at Gallipoli in 1915. Even though there are not probably any meaningful parallels between the ordeal of trench warfare and the discomfort of an early start on a rainy autumn morning in Canberra, comments like this suggest to me the extent to which the Anzacs have become a moral touchstone for many Australians, idols against whom we might measure our suffering and find in their courage the inspiration to press on. Indeed, Federica seems to have picked up the flavour of the dawn service very quickly. It feels as if I am attending a religious mass on plein air, in the open air, she writes in the introduction. As many of you will know, the Australian War Memorial is currently undergoing a $550 million renovation, a project which provides an ideal opportunity to expand its coverage of the frontier wars. From what we can discern, there is division on the board of the memorial about the issue of the frontier wars, with some Conservative members believing the frontier wars sit outside the ambit of the Australian War Memorial, Others appeared to believe that the frontier wars should be covered more expansively, and the chair of the board, Kim Beazley, the former politician, has been sort of making public comments about the fact that the memorial would be covering the frontier wars more expansively, but I gather that he might have been getting pushback from other members of the board. So these divisions will play out over the next few years as the huge renovation takes place. Dependent upon the changing composition of the Australian War Memorial Council, and there's recently been some new appointments to that, and the composition of the council depends in turn on which party is in government across Lake Burley Griffin. So settler military politics has appeared at a time of intense debate about the frontier wars and broader issues of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Australia. And I hope that Federica will be a part of those important debates. The achievements of settler military politics are scholarly, as well as having these applied uses as well. Federica has opened an exciting new area of settler colonial scholarship in the international relations of militarisation. And I know she is already taking her ideas about settler military politics into fascinating new directions. I congratulate Federica on the achievement of this excellent and important new book, Settler Military Politics, and I look forward to your ongoing contribution to scholarship, which I'm sure will be significant. Thank you. Now I'll hand over to Mia.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you, Federica, for inviting me to join you in this conversation about your wonderful new book. I want to echo Carolyn's comments about the significance of your work in furthering our understanding of Australia's military history and ongoing settler colonialism. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I am on Wurundjeri land, land that was never ceded. Settler military politics is an exemplary study of how race and gender have been contested, co-opted, and exploited by Australian defence institutions to legitimise the state and its war making. In this book, Federica shows that the militarisation of Indigenous people is not only about furthering reconciliation, but is a manoeuvre to legitimise the settler colonial state. And here I think Federica makes a really important argument. She proposes that the Indigenous soldier is the unsurpassed token of settler legitimacy because it shows the broader public that these Indigenous people are willing to commit the ultimate sacrifice for the settler polity. In this way, Federica reveals how military institutional efforts toward reconciliation in fact work to assimilate indigeneity into the settler colonial state. One of the important contributions of this book is in revealing the tensions between the elevation of different political groups in war commemoration. Federica highlights that the mid-20th century celebration of women in the Defence Force worked to obscure the contribution of Indigenous soldiers, upholding Australia's self-image as a white nation while performing progressivism through women's participation. However, Federica is also attentive to the ways in which non-white and non-male actors within settler military institutions have sought to broaden war commemoration and find their representation within it. She writes of Indigenous artists camouflaging references to the frontier wars in their art, covertly bringing memory of those wars into the Australian War Memorial. And she writes of the disruptive figures of anti-war activists and Aboriginal women in the militaries. In this way, her work explores ongoing tensions between the project of the military and those who serve it. So settler military politics therefore reveals the gap between the promise of diversity and inclusion in war service and commemoration and its reality. It highlights the ways in which minority soldiers are deployed by defence institutions to pass over the ongoing violence of the settler military state. And so reading this book, I just kept being struck again and again by the continuing relevance of her work in understanding the settler military politics of Australia's contemporary defence institutions. Federica's original approach of bringing together settler colonial politics and critical military studies helps us to understand the crucial context of Australia's war making today. The particular ways that Australian defence institutions have remembered their past and the particular groups that have been included and excluded from that memory. This foregrounds Australia's involvement in neo-colonial wars and helps to explain the ongoing problems of racism and misogyny among the ranks. So in understanding why Australia has told certain stories about its military past and what purposes those commemorations served, Federica has revealed the ongoing project of the settler colonial state and its military forces. So I don't want to take up any more time. I think we'd all rather hear from Federica. So Carolyn, would you like to ask the first question?
Thank you very much, Mia. So Federica, now we'd all love to hear from you. I'll begin with the first question. Now, you have a very interesting background for someone writing about Australian history and politics. I understand that you're originally from Sardinia, the beautiful island off the western coast of Italy, and then you spent several years in the UK, some of those working with Simon, by the sound of it. Can you tell us how your intellectual outlook has been shaped by that background, and what perspectives that background enables you to bring to your understanding of Australian politics?
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. And before I answer this question, I just want to thank Maria and WIIS Australia for hosting this. I want to thank Carolyn and Mia for participating in this book launch and saying all these great things about the book and taking the time to read. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Friday afternoon session. And I also want to extend my acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri War on people. And as a settler in this country, it's the bare minimum that I can do is to understand, colonization and race relations. So I hope that this book serves the quest for justice in this country, serves to advance Indigenous rights and the interests of Indigenous people. And to go to your question, Carolyn, I think that I'm definitely an outsider I'm an external observer. And I think it's quite unusual for people working on Australian politics and history. So I think in a way it's, it meant that I had to do an accelerated course on, Anzac Day, Indigenous politics, Australian history, Australian politics. And because when I came to Australia, I knew nothing about Australia. So that has been in a way good because I think I didn't have the cultural baggage that a lot of people working on Australian politics and history bring to the study of this field. But it was also challenging, and I think I was challenged a lot as well as a foreigner studying Australia. Australians just don't like to be studied. I guess that the Western world, Western scholars like to study the non-Western world, but when the Western world is the subject of study, there is a bit of unease, and it was interesting to watch that. And in terms of my background and journey, I guess I've always been acquainted with the military as a person that grew up in Sardinia. So Sardinia has 3 large military bases, one of which is the largest of Italy and one of the largest of the European Union. They were bases that were established as part of the US NATO Cold War strategy, and they still remain operational. So Sardinia just remains like a key geostrategic position, military position in Europe. And I think that the fascinating thing is that I didn't question all this military environment that was around me until pretty much the age of 17. So I left Italy when I was 18. And no one around, like in my circles, was asking questions about, the barbed wire that was in the city, or like the beach that was not accessible because it was contaminated. It was just normal. And I think for me, only started making sense when I encountered the scholarship on the feminist scholarship in international relations and critical military studies, which tries to bring to the fore the everyday dimension of militarism, that it kind of like hit me. I'm like, okay, so I was part of the problem. Like I was immersed in this military environment, but it was so normal to me that it never occurred to me to question it. And I think that that experience just keeps sitting with me, and everything, like all my work on the military is basically shaped by this experience of how normal the military was for me. Whereas, if a foreigner comes to Sardinia and sees these military bases, they're like, what's going on there? But when you're immersed in it, you just don't see it. And then the other part of the journey that shaped my experience, like my intellectual thinking that got me to the book, was that when I was in the UK, I mean, we're talking about the not the immediate post 9/11, but it was the times of the decade after 9/11, and I became quite interested in race relations. And in the UK at that time, the kernel of these relations was Islamophobia. So when I came to Australia, I kept pursuing the interest in race relation, but it was evident that the center of race relations here was different, right? So it revolved around indigeneity and settler relations. And so when I was in Brisbane at that time, I started to familiarize myself with race relations there, and I realized that there were two groups of people, at least that informed my thinking about race relations in Australia. So one was a very committed, smaller group of people that was walking the talk of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights, and they were demonstrating on Invasion Day, and they were quite active in engaging with the general public to kind of like propel Indigenous sovereignty. And then there was the vast majority of people in Australia that didn't want, like, was completely disengaged, didn't want to touch it, didn't want to hear it, didn't want to, like, it was too hot, too big, too distant for them to talk about Indigenous politics and rights. And so I think that I don't know, like the observation of these two groups of people was quite interesting to me. And I think that that's what kind of like got me to think about Indigenous politics, right? So why is there a small group of people that is so intensely attached to it, and the vast majority, it's completely disengaged?
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. I'll need to slip out in a moment, but I'll hand over to Mia, who'll be asking the next question.
Thanks. That was really interesting, Federica. Sort of to follow on from that, your book begins with this arresting description of a visit you made to the Australian War Memorial in 2017. Can you tell us about your experience on that field trip and how that shaped your research and the nature of the book that you eventually wrote?
Yeah, thank you, Mia. So I didn't come to Australia to study this topic. I was working on something completely different. As Carolyn mentioned before, I was working on visual politics, and I was interested in how representations of war inform nations and nationalism in liberal societies. So I came to Australia in 2015, and it was soon after the centenary, actually. But in conversation with a few people, including my supervisors, I decided that Anzac Day and the Australian War Memorial were going to be the center of my research, like the empirical work was going to be done there. So in 2017, I went to the Australian War Memorial to do research, and that's where somehow, yeah, like my thought and my research got hijacked, because so I found an exhibition at the Australian War Memorial that was extremely fascinating and puzzling, right? So it was an exhibition titled "For Country for Nation," which was a celebration, and I say celebration intentionally, of Indigenous service in the military of Australia. And like I couldn't reconcile, I guess, like my experience of race relations as I was coming to know them in Brisbane, where the activists that I encountered were definitely not propelling, like they were not proposing inclusion, they were proposing something a bit more radical, and the rest of the population was just not interested. So here I was standing in this exhibition that was advocating for inclusion, and also presenting the military as a bastion for Indigenous rights and recognition. And so I kept going back to this exhibition, and I just couldn't make sense. Like, I feel like I left the exhibition frustrated because I didn't learn. I learned about the personal stories of Indigenous people, but I didn't learn about the history that got them there. So I left this exhibition with more questions than answers. So that was one. And then when I was leaving the exhibition, like I live on Italian time, so I was a bit late, and there was a volunteer that was waiting for me to leave the exhibition. And as I was leaving, I went to him and I thanked him for his patience. And then he gave me a leaflet about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander commemorative service that was going to happen the day after, on Anzac Day. And again, like I didn't expect that there was going to be this. So And I didn't do much planning. I guess, that was not the main area of my research, but I wanted to go to these surveys. So the day after I went to Anzac Day, the dawn service of Anzac Day, and I was hoping that after the service they were going to give us some indication about where to go to attend the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service, but there was just nothing. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I have to find it on my own. So I asked a couple of volunteers. They looked at me like, what is this crazy woman with a crazy accent asking me? Like they didn't know about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service. So it became evident to me that it wasn't part of the Australian War Memorial was involved in the advertisement, but it wasn't involved in the organization, and they weren't running it basically. Anyway, so I ended up funding the service, and it was a very small service by Indigenous people, primarily for Indigenous people. So there was, like another thing that was quite interesting for this book. And then the third encounter that I made on that field work was in the afternoon. There is an Anzac march where every contingent marches towards the Stone of Remembrance and lays wreaths of flowers on the Stone of Remembrance. So there I was doing my laps on the Anzac parade, and then I walked to the tail of the Anzac parade, and I found that there was a group of people, some of whom I recognized from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service that morning. They were holding a banner saying, "Lest we forget the frontier wars." And then they also had banners listing all the massacres that of Indigenous people that happened in Australia. So I was quite interested. I approached them. We were chit-chatting. So I walked with them as they was marching, like I guess everybody can just walk with the contingents. So I was just walking with them. And then at some point we encountered a line of police officers. And I mean, like the last thing that you want to encounter as an immigrant in a country is a line of police officers. So I stepped, I stepped back, and I could see that the air was tense. And so I was just watching, and yeah, I didn't know what to expect, but there was like a tense silence between the line of police and the line of the people that were commemorating the frontier wars. But there was no violence. No one did anything. There was just a really palpable tense air. And then I saw a couple of people from the contingent to commemorating the frontier wars that took a couple of steps, and I was like, oh, this is gonna end bad. But they were holding some wreaths of flowers, and they put them at the feet of the police officers, and then they walked back, and they stood there. There was like this, what can we call it, standoff for like, let's say 5 minutes, and then the contingent of the frontier wars just walked away, and the police line dissolved. And it was like everybody knew the script apart from me, and I was just freaking out. So I think that was the other encounter. But in that moment, it clicked to me that the frontier wars were not inside of the exhibition of the Australian War Memorial. And of course, it also became evident that the contingent commemorating the frontier wars was not welcome on Anzac Day. So I guess that those three encounters were the kind of like things that those are the encounters that made me want to write this book. So I went back to Brisbane, went to my supervisor and said, "Roland, I want to change the topic of my supervisor of my dissertation." And Roland was like, "No." Bless his wisdom, I didn't change the topic of my thesis, but as soon as I submitted the thesis, the first thing that I did was just to go back to this. And so the interesting thing about this book is that the data that ended up going into this book was not collected for this project. So it's data that is being repurposed to fit within a new framework.
Thanks. That's fascinating. I love that the way these different stories have sort of brought you to this point of realization. And on that framework that you mentioned, one of the important and original things about your book is the way it's putting critical military studies and the concept of militarization into conversation with settler colonial theory to produce this concept of settler military politics. Can you explain these terms, these concepts to us, and the significance of combining them to arrive at this concept of settler military politics?
Yeah. So the book is published in a series that is specifically on critical military studies. So the contribution is specifically to the subfield of critical military studies, which is it originates from the feminist work in international relations that is looking at militarism as something that it's not doesn't pertain just to high politics or war or military build up, but is instead something that happens in the everyday, and it involves people that don't wear the uniform. It involves things such as popular culture, war commemoration, emotions as well. So that's the kind of critical that's the field of literature that I'm trying to contribute with my work. And there is some literature in this field of study that looks at post-colonial militarism. And so at the beginning, I was trying to use that scholarship, but it just became evident that it didn't reach far enough to understand Australia as a settler colonial state and society. So, so it's important to understand the distinction between a post-colonial society and a settler colonial society, right? Because that's where the limitation for me of the post-colonial literature was. So this is not work that I've done myself. I'm drawing from the scholarship of other people such as, Lorenzo Veracini, Aline Morton Robinson, Jane Curry, and others. So they basically say that in post-colonial societies, there are moments that we can identify as moments of decolonization. So those moments where basically the colonizers left and to different extent, of course, handed over power back to the colonized people. Whereas in societies like Australia, there was never such a moment of decolonization. And instead, the colonizers have become the large majority in the settler society. So the difference is that, like if we were to boil down the difference between post-colonial societies and settler societies, is that in settler societies, colonization is an ongoing thing. And of course, it's uncomfortable to have that thought in our mind, but, we live in an ongoing colonial project. And so what I wanted to capture with settler military politics was, how military politics unfolds in an ongoing situation of colonization. And I think that for me, what prompted that thought was that was when I was watching, all these forms of inclusion, but also politics of resistance that I just described in the previous answer. There were questions about inclusion of Indigenous people in a settler nation in a country that is still unfolding its colonial project. And so that, there are questions about inclusion and resistance that I wanted to, I wanted to understand how the military affairs, that I kind of like tackled through the proxy of war commemoration, were influencing the consolidation, but also the trajectory of the settler state. Not to be pessimistic, but like Australia will never decolonize. So the only thing that will have, like Australia will be forever a settler state. The only thing that can occur is the resistance will shape the settler nation, hopefully in the trajectory of reconciliation and transitional justice after conflict. That's all we can hope for. And so what I wanted to do with this book, and what I'm trying to do also with the work that's coming from this book into the next projects, is to understand how military politics have kind of like influenced the formation of the settler state, but also create opportunities to transform the settler state as we know it. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do with this concept.
Fantastic, thank you. We're going to move to a Q&A, so please start getting your questions ready in the chat, or think about one where you might like to pop your hand up. But I just want to ask one more before we move to the Q&A. Federica, your book traces the trajectory of inclusion of Indigenous service into Australian War Commemoration across history. So you sort of began to touch on this in your last answer, but what do you think are the attitudes among Indigenous Australians about their incorporation over the last few decades into the Anzac legend, and where do you see it going in the future?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I've got to say that it's hard to answer this question without I haven't done research specifically on this, but I can share some observations. And the observations are from people that, Indigenous people that are somehow directly involved with Anzac, or actually, let's say military service. And I think it would be possibly a different story for the people who are not directly involved with military service, right? But the people that are, to a certain extent, like other service members or their family, the sense that I have is that they like to be included, right? So it's good that they are included, and the reason is that it gives them an opportunity to basically bring to the fore Indigenous issues and Indigenous histories. So like, as much as we want to do, from a more critical perspective, we can be critical of inclusion. It's really important to recognize how that inclusion opens space for change. That might not be the radical change that people of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy might want to see, right? But it's still a space for change. And I think that I realized that so the first article that I've written on this topic, so it's like first thing after the handover of my PhD, was one on the exhibition for Country for Nation, which, as I mentioned before, left me extremely frustrated. I think I was like mildly angry about how the story was narrated. So I think that was probably the motivation that got me to write about the exhibition. I think that the frustration was around the sense that Indigenous service was basically used to make the settler state look good, right? So that was the frustration that I was feeling. But the more I sat with the data, and the more I was thinking about, the story that the exhibition was telling, the more I realized how, in a way, radical the exhibition was. So the exhibition was, first of all, curated by, well, not entirely, but it was curated in collaboration with an Indigenous curator. And it was collecting not just the archival material of Indigenous soldiers, but also the artwork of Indigenous people, some of whom were commissioned specifically for the exhibition. And despite the fact that there was not a linear timeline for a person to understand the history that led Indigenous people to serve, and there was very little, like the narration was one-sided, very much, like was very much one-sided. I think, like the more I sat with the artwork, and the more I realized the spaces of resistance, right? So, for example, there was one painting that was about and of course I had to do research on this because I would have not been able to pick the visuality of it, but it was about a massacre of Indigenous people. So, like, I guess that for the lay audience like myself, on that day, I would have not been able to pick that this artwork was about frontier violence. But if you are an Indigenous person going to see this exhibition, right? And there were other instances, such as, the presentation of Indigenous weapons. And there was an artwork that was showcasing the Indigenous people wearing the different uniforms of the military. And at the very last image was an Indigenous person wearing his warrior, like traditional warrior outfit. So there were spaces for resistance that weren't immediately visible to me. And I think that what I'm trying to say here is that inclusion in settler institutions such as the military and others, the university is probably one of those as well, create space for Indigenous people to tell the story like they want that to be told, as opposed to let's say if the War Memorial was to include the frontier wars with a top-down approach, who knows, but I think that my sense is that they would just have it as an add to the story rather than a change the story kind of approach. And so I think that, what I'm trying to say is that these spaces for inclusion create forms of resistance that can significantly change the narrative in an incremental way that might not be immediately visible.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to pop up your hand or put them in the chat.
I actually have a question, if you don't mind me popping in. And that is, Federica, I love hearing you talk about, how, we want to see big radical change because we need it. And in some ways, you need a structural change to fix things, in a significant way. But I love how you talked about how, still incremental things can make a difference and can happen, can help. Are there any other incremental or, sort of if you were called up in front of someone and with policy authority and they said, what's one change we could make? What might you tell them, based on your research?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. Like, I think that perhaps the first thing that needs to change in relation to, this research and war commemoration is we need to be more candid about colonial warfare, right? So there is still resistance to calling colonization in this country war, but I think it's an important history to reckon with, and I think that the frontier wars have been excluded from the Australian War Memorial on the premise that they are not war, and the reason being that the definition of war is very narrowly defined as like in Eurocentric terms, right? So it's basically two militaries that face one another. It's about people in uniform. But that was, as we know, that was not the case in Australia, right? So colonial warfare was waged primarily by the native police. It was it involved, people not in uniform. It involved also civilians with guns. As soon as the British Army left, basically there was an increment in the availability of small weapons in colonial society in Australia, and so those were the people that were the primary actors of colonial warfare. And on the other hand, we have Indigenous people and their way of war, which is definitely not the military strategy like we might think in European terms. So because colonial warfare looks so different from a Eurocentric or a European kind of warfare, then it has been excluded from the remit of the Australian War Memorial by Act. So there's like the 1980 War Memorial Act basically defines warfare such that colonial warfare gets excluded. So I think that probably the first policy would need that, I guess that my research would suggest to change would be that very act, such that the frontier wars can be included in the Australian War Memorial. But I would also add to that that I would like to see the frontier wars as not just an addition to the original, like to the narrative of the Anzac and World War One as the origin of Australia, but rather, shift the narrative altogether. And I think that would be a bit more difficult, right? So when we look at how war, influenced the identity of Australia, the primary war that we want to think about, it's not World War One, but rather it's colonial warfare. And I guess that in the mind of a lot of people, the reason why we're not doing that is because it's confrontational, right? So there's, like, you are highlighting the confrontation, whereas if you highlight the contribution of Indigenous people to modern warfare, then you can highlight a moment of inclusion, not inclusion, sorry, of working together. But I guess that for me, the frustration of that narrative is that you can't tell the story of Indigenous people and settlers working together without telling the struggles the Indigenous people faced to be in that position, and the reasons why Indigenous people decided to join in the first place, right? So they weren't serving the crown, right? So they were serving their country, and that becomes very evident in the stories of Indigenous Service. So it would be, yeah, like, I guess that the short answer to that question would be, we need to change the narrative through the inclusion of the Frontier Wars in the Stonewall Memorial.
So we've got some questions in the chat. Jane Marie Hardy says, congrats on a fascinating book and book launch, Federica.
Oh, thank you.
She's focused on the artwork representation of First Nations involvement in Australia's military history. Australia is more aware of that representation in historic and current sporting achievements, much slower on the military front. Have you noticed any crossover between artistic or photographic depictions between sporting and military involvement of First Nations people?
That's a very good, and I didn't even think about that, but there is definitely a connection between, or like some, what can you say, intellectual link that we can make between war and sport. But I guess that's more like food for thought, because I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not a sports person. Yeah. Thank you for that question though, Jane.
That's great. We've got another one from Miriam Bankovsky. Could you tell us about the research you did on the Native police, and what would your recommendations be in relation to how this might be depicted and represented in war commemoration?
Yeah, that was such a hard story to digest, history. It was really hard to do research on the Native police, primarily because it was sickening. So basically, the Native police was a police force that was originally intended to resemble the Metropolitan Police in the UK, but it was evident that in Australia the problems that the police was facing were different from the UK. So the Native police was specifically designed to deal with the problem of the natives. And the sickening part was that it involved in a few selected Indigenous people to do missions of like punishing missions, and they were basically unleashing Indigenous people against other Indigenous people in different regions, right? So it was really hard to read. Lots of people, like, that was the primary hand of like the arm of the frontier wars on the side of the settlers, and it was very violent history, and how that story can be included, I don't know. I think that it's really hard story to include, because history to include, because of the ways in which Indigenous people were themselves involved in their own colonization. So I think that I wouldn't there to make recommendations just yet because I think it would require consultation with Indigenous people. It's history that I mean, I think it's still fresh because it's only starting to emerge. And some people are still grappling with the realization that, you know, for example, their family might have been involved in the settlement of some parts of Australia where they were not from, if that makes sense. So basically, Indigenous people were taken from parts of Australia and they moved to other parts of Australia to be more effective in basically hunting other Indigenous people.
Incredibly difficult history to be working with that. We have a question, a raised hand from Simon Philpott.
Thanks, but I realise you've got other questions in the chat that came before mine. So if you want to work through those, I'm happy to wait.
That's okay. We can jump between
Okay.
me speaking and others. That's fine.
All right, thank you. Many congratulations, Federica, on the book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. One of the things I mean, I've been abroad for 20 plus years, and I can't help but notice significant changes in Australia, some of them for the better upon return. We sat and acknowledged the unceded nature of sovereignty from all the various places from which we're kind of meeting and talking today, things that weren't happening when I left the country 20-something years ago. And I'm kind of interested in how, as someone who's also lived in the UK, you might sort of reflect on the differences between Australia grappling with this sort of history of settler militarism and the effects on Indigenous peoples, and the complete absence of that recognition in the UK. I guess one of the things I really wearied of living there was being told what a racist country I came from, and it's like, yes, but you know, at least there are efforts to sort of grapple with these difficulties and confront some of these things that I just don't see in the UK. So how might you account for what progress there has been in Australia compared to the UK, and what might it be about Australian society that's different from the UK that accounts for that?
Yeah, I think it's about proximity, right? So I think that the imperial metropole, Britain, as soon as they dropped Australia, they washed their hands off. That was no longer their problem, right? So I think it's you know, I think that Australia is attached to Britain, but Britain is no longer attached to Australia, and that's a reality of politics in Australia, where, you know, I think Australia still feels an attachment to Britain, but I don't think that Britain feels much of an attachment to Australia. So I can't see a world in which a country like Australia in 2024 would not make efforts to acknowledge indigenous people and indigenous country, but I guess that Britain is washing its hands off because they don't have indigenous people living. Oh well, I guess I guess that they don't have the same store, like they don't have the same proximity of indigenous people living in Britain like they have it in Australia, right? So the imperial metropole didn't have to deal with that, right? If that makes sense. Yeah, I guess that's the answer that I have.
Thanks, Federica. We're running close on time, so I might just ask one more question, because I think a lot of people would be interested to know where you think this work is going to take you next, because this book opens up so many possibilities for you in terms of ongoing work on war commemoration, diversity, civil military relations, settler militarism. So do you have another project in mind to follow on from this? And can you tell us more about what led you to it?
Yeah, sometimes I forget that I just published a book because I'm already onto the next project, actually. So I've recently put together a project that looks at the service of Indigenous people in comparison, so like comparing Australia, New Zealand, and Canada today, right? So instead of looking at history, or instead of looking at war commemoration, I'm looking at settler military politics today. And a key limitation of the book of Certain Military Politics is that because of how I had to repurpose the data for a different project into the framework of settler colonialism, it means that I didn't get to talk to Indigenous people themselves, right? So what I'm trying to do with the new project is to get the stories of people that are serving today, to see the spaces for resistance that service might allow them. And I'm also interested in, whether their service can advance reconciliation, and if it advances reconciliation, what kind of reconciliation are we talking about, right? So reconciliation is a very contested term, and I've got a sense that settler states have a different understanding of reconciliation that the average Indigenous person might. And sometimes so I've done some fieldwork research in Canada, talking to Indigenous service people there. And, I've asked them about reconciliation specifically, and none of them was sold on the concept of reconciliation. But in so many words, they were highlighting, or they were talking about things that could be called reconciliation. So I think that it's a project that could advance a different kind of understanding of reconciliation. It could advance the idea that perhaps reconciliation as it has been presented so far doesn't resonate with Indigenous people. So what I'm looking at is, I'm looking at the initiatives that the Defense of District countries have to attract Indigenous people, and what Indigenous people who serve today get from the service, and whether this service can eventually further some conception of reconciliation.
Gosh, that sounds wonderful. I'm really looking forward to seeing the work that you'll continue to do, because it's just wonderful. We don't have time to answer all the questions in the chat, but I really encourage everyone to ask your libraries to purchase Federica's book. I've dropped a link in the chat, and she's let me know that there's a paperback version coming out early next year, which is the more affordable one if you want your own copy as well. And hopefully that book will answer many of your questions. So please join me in thanking Federica for sharing her time to tell us more about her wonderful book.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mia, for facilitating this. And thank you, Maria, for hosting.
Absolutely. Look, thank you so much, Federica and Mia and Carolyn, in her absence. The book, there is so much there. It's rare that you get a book that is so theoretically rich and yet has so many current important policy implications. It's really, there's so much here. So thank you, Federica, for sharing your time. I just want to mention to everyone, our next WIIS Australia event is happening on September 25th. We're having a Meet the Expert series with Shada Shetty, who is the head of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. And that's sort of our sort of very informal conversation about a senior woman working in the security space in Australia. So I encourage you to come to that. And again, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for all the questions about Federica's book as well. Take care, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.